Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are here with Dr. Kirsten Hill, and she will be our guest speaker as we talk about ethics in research. And there's so much to talk about in ethics. I know that me and you tag each other quite a bit in things that we see online where we're just like, oh, how can this research be done? So I guess let's just start with kind of a general definition of what you do, Kirsten, and how you analyze data.
Yeah. So I was trained as a researcher in like the humanities, like social sciences. So my background is in education policy research. But as part of that, I did a lot of methodology. So, like survey design, interviews, focus groups, administrative data, just had the opportunity to work with a lot of like community partners and just people doing like innovative work in different spaces to collect information that they felt like could either say, hey, like this is a great idea, we should keep investing in it, it's working, or alternatively, like, let's never do this again, or like, let's change it significantly. And I've been in that big bucket of space of like people trying to do research for good for like 12 years now.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and I think I first spoke with you a couple months ago and just feel like there's like whatever sector you're in, like your people are doing research, right? And like there
Yeah.
are just like best practices that it's like no matter who's doing the research, like for
Mm-hmm.
what ends, like these are things that we should all be doing. And I think either because people don't know or they're in a rush or it like seems like a pain, we like skip a lot of important steps sometimes. And then we end up with just like really trash data that people might not even know is trash, right? Like, which is
Mm-hmm.
the most frustrating part, I think.
Well, I think when you start moving into trash data territory, then you're really on the ethical side, right? Because if you're presenting trash data as truth,
Yes.
you're lying to people, right? It's a
Oh,
lie.
100%. 100%. I totally agree. And I think it's like there's different groups of people, right? There's people who like intentionally manipulate data to try to
Mhm.
get something to happen. And then I think there are people who just like don't realize that that's bad information. And so they're making decisions or having other people make decisions based on bad information. To me, I'm like, they're both bad, right? Like
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
we don't want either of those things. Like we don't want people to manipulate things, but we also don't want people to unknowingly be sharing information that's like not going
Yeah.
to help anyone.
Exactly. It's like bad is bad. But I
Yeah.
think, being an outsider, right? Like if you're an outsider to science and you look at data, it can be confusing. It's hard to kind of know where to draw those lines of what makes it science and what makes it just an
Yeah.
interesting fact or a one-off, right?
Totally.
Um,
Totally.
and when I hear you explain sometimes about what you see in the mistakes that are done on a very large public forums, with big companies even
Yeah.
making these mistakes, then it clicks with me. But if I hadn't had someone tell me, hey, this isn't done because of XYZ, wasn't done to prepare this data.
Yeah.
If I didn't have a voice like that, I may take it just at face value, right?
Yeah.
And think that these numbers were true. And something that I think was interesting that we were talking about was how when you're trying to get percentages of population, like for example, in my space of neurodiversity, every website almost has a different number, right? Like
Right.
1 in 5 people, 1 in 7
Yeah.
people, 1 in 4 people, as many as 1 in 3 people. It just depends like
Yeah.
where you're looking for that data. So
Yeah.
what are some tips that you have on sourcing that data or trying to find truth in those numbers?
I think I always like really encourage people to investigate like where they came from, right? Because you could talk to like only 20 people and like end up with a thing that says 1 in 5 people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's like if you only talk to 20 people, like I don't know if I really trust the 1 in 5 because you only talk to 20 people, right? So I think
Yeah.
it's like whenever I look at a number, people are like, research finds this new thing. I always first am thinking, who did they like get this data from in terms of one, how many people? I want to know, again, did you talk to 20 people, 30 people, 10,000 people? I think size matters, but also where the people like came from and what their demographics are. How old were they? What cities and states or countries were they in? That all matters too, because to me, sometimes you get things that are skewed. People were only talking people who identified as men. That changes whether or not I think that that's true, right? You want like a representative sample, or maybe you don't want a representative sample, but just don't hide it, right? Whatever the 1 in 5 is, I want to know who are the people that rolled into that 1 in 5 answer. I also think the time in terms of what year the information came from. I think we can all recognize that a lot has changed in the past, like just the past few years, right?
Mhm.
But even before that, there are decisions or people promote things on their website based on data that came from like the 80s or 90s. That was a long time ago at this point, right? So I feel very differently looking at data that was collected in the 80s in a totally different context than something that happened like last year, and even something that happened pre 2020 to now. It was such, the world was so different. So I think knowing when those stats were created is really important too, because that can just filter, okay, like 1 in 5 people in 1975 said this. I don't know if maybe it means something to you. I think the key is you having all the information to decide if that's data you want to trust. And I think that's similar. I see a lot of, I think I posted this on LinkedIn the other day, but people reporting things on millennials, and then you read the age ranges they use, and I'm like, that's not even millennials. Like they also have people who were born like in the 2000s, and 2000s babies are not millennials. So it's just, I just want to know the frame of reference, because I dig into that and I'm like, okay, you're literally counting like Gen X, like, and millennials and Gen Z all in this. So I don't know if I believe it just for millennials. I think just being able to have all that context to say, yeah, I don't trust that, right? Because of the information. So that's like, those are
Mhm.
like basic things. And then I think you could also get into what did they ask to get that information, right? And like what kinds of, how did their experiment look? I think those things can be harder if you're not in the research space, because maybe you don't know about all the different research designs and methodologies. And I honestly think a lot of the first checklisty things about like who they asked and when can knock out a good bit of data just right out of the gate.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm guilty of thinking anyone younger than me as a millennial just because I can't wrap my mind around that I am old enough to have several generations
Right?
behind
I
me.
know.
So,
Totally.
yeah, I
Totally.
find the chart is very helpful. But so when we talk about research in medicine, and you see this a lot in commercials, they will say, what are the side effects? In the US, we have to list so many side effects, but it's
Gosh, yeah.
kind of very um, foggy on the rules, right? Like
Yeah.
we watch those commercials and laugh and say, oh, they're listing so many things, but really they're not compared to what's in probably the
Yeah.
investigator brochure, right? And so,
Mm,
what constitutes as something that is reportable and something that fits into that space, that commercial space, that can be very, you know, dependent on what the client or the drug company wants to put forward. So
that's a
even though we have rules on saying things like this could cause this, those are muddied. It's not as clear as if usually the guideline I think is around 10%. If 10% of people had this, then you should say it in a commercial. But sometimes there's so many of those things that they're not going
yeah.
to say all of them within that commercial. Or you notice that they try to speak very quickly to
Very
list a
so
lot
quickly.
to
That's what
list a
I
lot
was.
of things.
Yeah.
But then the science behind the 10% is so confusing to most people because it doesn't mean 10% of people will have this, right? It's a possibility.
Yeah.
And so explaining that statistic can be difficult.
Well, I think too that goes back to individual like risk factors and characteristics. Like it's just very complex, and like you're just left with a number that it's
Hmm.
like, oh, like this is going to happen to that many people, and then that inspires. Well, I think one of two ways. Some people are like scared because they think 10% is high, and then some people are like, oh, that's like so low, it doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter.
Yeah.
But I totally agree. I mean, consistency in research and with standards, I think is so important. And I think also just the idea of like informed consent in every field. I think it's hard to be like if you're deciding to take a drug and you don't really understand the side effects or your risk, like to me, I'm like, are you fully? I take Advil every day. I have no idea what the side effects are of Advil. You know what I mean? Like I would say I'm not informed. Like I'm taking that risk on myself because I really haven't looked into it. I just take it and I'm trusting. But it's like, is that right though? Like if you're going to try like a new drug or a new thing, shouldn't you should know, right? And be able to decide like with your doctor and be like, okay, like is this right for me or not? And I think that it can be so hard with all the jargon and statistics to like figure it out and take time that people don't have.
Yeah. And I think the basic science of understanding how, research works is a lot of people don't understand all the steps that go into getting a drug approved and on the
Yeah.
market. And I was in a conference this week where they were talking about, if Advil were up for being over the counter now, it would never get approved because of the side effects of Advil,
That's so
right?
funny. Yeah.
Um, but it's something that we've had for so long, and you
Yeah.
see some countries are actually pulling back on that drug being over the counter. It is interesting because most people will never have those extreme side
Yeah.
effects, or you may have a one-off side effect but never have that side effect again.
Yeah.
Our bodies are very complicated, and science isn't exact, right? It's always moving and changing, and I think that's
Yeah.
something that made people very uncomfortable during COVID.
Yeah.
There were no concrete answers because science moved and changed and learned. And I
Yeah.
think we need to make sure we're keeping those conversations open.
Yeah. I think that really speaks to also the intersection between science and policy, right? Because I think to make things policies, people want things like set in stone or going to pretend like it's not going to change. And you're right. Like the whole idea of science is that you're constantly learning and like trying to disprove things. Like at any time it could change. And really, it's better. Like if we've learned something's not working or we need to do something different, that's great that we've learned it, but to
Yeah.
the public, I think that can feel very scary. And it's like, oh, well, like we thought like now it's this different thing. And it's to your point where I think that is like the scientific process. That's actually like very normal that that would happen.
Mhm.
But I don't know, like I went to public school. I'm like, we didn't really learn that much. You know what I mean? We didn't learn that much about the intersection of like science and making policies and making decisions. And it was just kind of like, learn the steps to do an experiment and that was it. But I think in that world context, there is like more public education that needs to go on so that people feel comfortable.
Yeah. And I think it's the ethical part is holding back the information, right? If we learn something new and we're afraid to release it to the public because of reaction or pushback, that's an ethical concern because
Yeah.
the public does need to be aware of things as they come up or as we learn
Yeah.
about the science. And I can see a lot of right now, in particular, fear around AI technologies and
Yeah.
things like that in the research space. And I read an article that someone posted on LinkedIn the other day that was talking about healthcare, mental health care apps
Mm.
as being not helpful, is what the article had said. But when I read the article, I was like, where are these numbers coming from? I
Yeah.
should send this to Dr. Hill because she will not agree with this article.
Oh my gosh. But it's just like it just happens so often, and we get a lot of our information from articles. I posted something. This was probably like a year ago now, but there was like a study on why people weren't going to Disney World, and I thought this was such a good example because it was like people aren't going to Disney World like because they're worried about COVID. That literally was like not even what they asked. Like if you went and looked at the actual questions, they ask like, are you going to Disney World, or like, are you changing your trip? And then separately they ask about like your fears about COVID. I'm like, how you can't put those two things together. Like I could not be going to Disney. I could be very afraid of COVID, but not going to Disney because it's like, you don't know
Hmm.
unless you ask, like, are you not going because of COVID? Right. But I
Yeah.
think these like articles come out and it's just like these types of apps are bad. They're not helping mental health. And it's like, well, how did you figure that out? And most people aren't going to do the work to like dig in to how they learned it. So you're going to see the headline and be like, okay, like, guess I'm not going to use that app, like, guess I
Hmm.
won't use this as a tool to help my mental health because it won't work. And that's like sad and also just scary, which gets me on like just thinking about the press a lot because so many people it's like, oh, we like fact check and we look for misinformation. I'm like, then maybe we need to like redefine what misinformation is, because a lot of the headlines that come out to me, I'm like, that to me is misinformation because that's like not what the research said. And like if that's going to be the headline that pulls people in, like that's
Hmm.
wrong, right? But it's been fact checked and it's okay. And it's just like, what?
Yeah, I think a lot of times it's the attention grabbing,
Yeah.
right? They'll put whatever as the attention grabber, and
Yeah.
then you get into the article and it may not even be talking about that at all, or it
Yeah.
may be the opposite of what they're using in the title.
Yeah.
Um, it is interesting, like where that line is, but in terms of research, I think miscommunication or taking statistics out of context or
Yeah.
quoting research articles out of context, that is such a problem ethically, because you could be
Yeah.
harming people that maybe have a rare disease and maybe they should
Yeah.
be looking at that treatment. But because
Yeah.
they read this snippet that you pulled from a research of like from the 60s or whatever,
Yeah.
now they're
Yeah.
scared to look at this kind of drug. So I
Yeah.
think that there's a heavy burden there, right?
Yeah. And it puts a lot of pressure on relationships that people have with their like medical and health professionals. Cause it's like, if you're doing all this independent research and coming to conclusions by yourself, you're right. Like you could see something and decide, like, oh, this isn't for me. Or then maybe you do come in and see a doctor. And it's like you need to have that like trusting relationship there and feel like they know more about like I was like, I'm not a medical professional. I can read studies and be like, I think this is like bullshit, but I'm like, I'm not in the medical field. So like I would rather go into a doctor and be like, can you explain this to me, and like have that relationship where you're trusting. And I think the culture right now is like very distrustful. And I think it is because people have been bombarded with so much stuff that either like wasn't the full truth or like was true but then it changed and like didn't explain why it changed. And so I think we're facing this huge barrier of like nobody trusts anyone anymore.
Yeah. I think that's true, especially with our doctors. I know me personally, I've had two doctors retire in the last couple of years that I used regularly. So it's hard to find a new doctor, and then
Yeah.
you get that relationship to where you feel that it's trustworthy.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people aren't going into the field anymore. We even have schools. I think NYU maybe offers medical school at no cost if you're able to get into the program, because
Wow.
we've seen those numbers, decline. So I don't know. It's hard to kind of fill in those gaps. We're seeing, a gap
Yeah.
in expertise on the medical side, and then
Yeah.
how is the consumer going to know? And you hear all the time, oh, don't be a Google,
Yes. Oh
Google
my
doctor.
gosh. Don't be on WebMD. I get
Yeah,
that. Yeah. All
yeah.
the
But what are you
time.
supposed to do when you can't see a doctor or
Yeah.
you don't have a relationship with a doctor, right? So we
Yeah.
need to start thinking of those things. How are we going to help support the future
Yeah.
healthcare needs of people?
Yeah. I love that too. I'm such a Googler of like anything medical related. And it's just I like to be like informed though, right? I was like, I want to know like honestly, I'm like, I want to know about these weird side effects so I can like ask the doctor about them. And and I get it.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's gotta be frustrating to have everyone just Googling their own advice and then coming to see you. But there's some like it seems an educational gap of sorts, right? Because you don't want to
Yeah.
feel like you have I don't want to feel powerless in the situation. Like I have to do whatever you say because you're the doctor. Like I want to feel like I have some context where I can also like play a role in the decision making.
Yeah. Well, something that happened to me recently, which I think is backwards. I went to the doctor for like a checkup and I got blood work done. And then I went home. And I'm thinking, okay, so when am I going to know about the blood work? And they said, oh, we'll let you know. Um, they really didn't. I got a mailer, that had the results, and I see all these highs everywhere. So I'm like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, what does this mean? Like I have off the charts in these areas. And I called the doctor and they said, oh, you're fine. The nurse said, you don't need to schedule another appointment. You're fine. Well, I would think I would need to take the blood work and
Yeah.
then see the doctor because then I could have gotten answers
Yeah.
from the test instead of seeing the doctor, doing blood work, and getting no answers.
Yeah.
And then I called a different doctor, and they said, "Well, statistics have changed recently, and from when I was a doctor to now. So some of these things are marked as high, but we don't really consider them high because we were trained under the old system." So then you're left wondering, okay, so why did they change the system,
Yeah.
and what does it mean to me, right? Like,
Oh my gosh,
I don't know.
totally. Oh, that really resonates with me as I also had blood work done recently and a lot, they have the little asterisk where it's like not normal.
Mhm.
Same. It's like, oh, well, everything's normal. I'm like, well, it's not. Everything's not normal because I'm looking at it and it says that it's not. But it is, it's just like something where I feel as though people err on the side of not wanting to give you too much information. It's like, we don't want to overwhelm you or confuse you, but then
Mhm.
we don't get enough. Because I would rather get a call that says, these three show up abnormal, but like recently we've decided, whatever is more accurate. So they actually are normal and it's fine. And that would make
Yeah.
me feel, that I'd probably still Google it to be honest with you, but it would make me feel better just to feel like
Yeah, and I think that recently, the FDA has issued a guidance on including more diverse
I saw
candidates
that.
in
Yeah.
research. Yeah, and when you look at the past research that has been done that wasn't as diverse, you know, do we have an obligation to go back and look at that and re-examine those numbers and then look at how to be more inclusive in the trial instead of exclusive? A lot of
Yeah.
trials are based on exclusion criteria, so how you can exclude people from the
Yeah.
pool, and that's done to get clean data sets. But are those clean data sets as can they include a little more and not change the science behind it? I think that's the question
Yeah.
more on the data science side, that
Yeah.
I'm outside of that world. But it is interesting, like how to be more inclusive as a change of mind, right? Instead of excluding.
Yeah. Well, and even just having the goal of, I know for me, if I'm reading about a medical trial, I want to know that people who are like me were in that trial. I think that, like, because to me, it'd be like, okay, great. Like, it worked really well for all these people who are nothing like me. How do I know
Mhm.
it would work for me? And I think that does speak to like fears people have around like not going for things that are newer or whatever. And it's like, yeah, if it was a more diverse group that it was tested in, unless I think if you can make it like medically, it doesn't matter, right? I'm like, if medically it doesn't matter, my like, I can't imagine like gender and like age and race don't matter at all, but maybe, and then you can say that and be like, actually, none of those things contribute to this at all. So it really doesn't matter what the sample looks like. That's one thing. But if you can't say that, I think to build the trust with people, to have like good data that actually says for all people, it's like you can't say for all people if you only tested it on like one type of people, right? It's kind of like,
Mm.
even as like the vaccines rolled out, it's like different age brackets, right? It mattered that like there were different age brackets. So it's not like you would just test something with like 40 to 45-year-olds and be like, oh, it's good for everyone. Like, well,
Mhm.
how could you possibly know that? you didn't include
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting uh, what's going to happen in the next couple of years in research. It's kind of an exciting time to be, involved in seeing these changes. And um, what are some things, though, that you see consistently when you're looking at data that is out there in the public? Like when a company says 70% of users, blah, blah, blah. What are some errors that you're constantly seeing with those numbers and those statements that are being out?
I think like one consistently, I never see anything about the people they got that information from reported,
Mhm.
right? It's like it's a headline number. Maybe sometimes they'll tell you how many people it came from, a lot of times not, but you never get to know from like a DEI perspective, like what, like, was it a diverse group or not? I think that that's never there.
Mhm.
And I also think, you don't often get to see the questions that were asked. So when companies are like, people really like this, or people would buy this, or people, think this is a great idea, you don't get to actually see like how they came to that conclusion. And that always bugs me a little because you see like how you ask questions and the phrasing actually really matters, right? Like if the dentist, there's always like, however many dentists like recommend this toothpaste. It's like, well, what if you find out that it was like, would you recommend like A or B? And so like 4 out of 5 picked B, but the only other choice was A, right? But that would get reported as like this many people recommend B. And it's like that many people recommend B compared to A. Like that's the accurate way to report that.
Mhm.
But that doesn't sound as like sexy or cool or like compelling. So it's like, oh, we'll
Yeah.
just like say this part. And I think a lot of times when you like dig into like how exactly it was asked, it's like you didn't really ask like, was this, someone's most favorite thing, did it make a huge difference? It's just like that's
Mhm.
not how you asked it. You asked it in a different way. Like this is how that number looks good. I think a lot of times too things are like small sample sizes, which I mean it's hard to get a big sample. I've like done, and it's not that you can't learn anything from a small sample size. I just think again you just have to be upfront about that.
Mhm.
Um, and gosh, I just think about like TikTok and like things going viral. I think the biggest thing I've seen recently that's like annoyed me, two things. One is people just resharing shocking statistics that they don't know where they came from. The number of articles who like if you wrote in and were like, where did this number come from? People don't know. There was a meme that went around about reading and how like after high school, like it was basically like no one read a book after high school, and it was like this huge graphic and it was like all over TikTok and it was all over Instagram. And so I googled it because I was like, I'm like do a ton of work in education, I'm like that's insane. If that's true, like whoa, that's wild. And the person who made that infographic came out like many many years ago and was like, it's not true, I have no idea where that came from. And it's like, but like that went viral, right? Or
Mhm.
Jay Shetty had a video go viral on how people would rather be shocked than sit with like their thoughts for like 5 minutes. I can't remember exact amount of time. And that study too, it's like if you go in at how they determined it, it's like one, they only looked at college students. So like, do you think that's really true? It was only college students. But also they didn't actually like present it as like sit alone with your thoughts or shock yourself. It was like you're
Mhm.
alone in this room and like you could push a button to shock yourself if you wanted to. But also, P.S., the shock feels like an electric, like a static electric shock. So it was just like all these things. I'm like, but if you have all that context, suddenly it's not that interesting. So of course people aren't sharing that. But I think like these like very like memeable viral like shock value things come out. And it's just like, there's no way, like there's no way
Yeah.
that's true. It'd be cool if it was, but I'm like, it's probably not. And this, the minute you dig in, it's just like, whoa, like either everyone agrees someone made this up at some point, or they just like can't find the source, which is
Mhm.
wild, or you go into how that study unfolded and are like, huh, like, is that really what it's saying? No.
Yeah, I would think a lot of studies would be based on college students, right? Because I have a master's in psychology, and almost all my research was on campus
One
with
guy,
other
right?
students because it's the pool you're around. It's easy to get
Right.
those.
It's interesting
responses.
though, right? When you think about how all that gets generalized to like the general population, and like college students are not the general population. And so it's so
Mhm.
interesting to your point of like redoing things. It's like, I wonder if like there are like psychological studies that need to be redone because we've only done them in the context of like people who are attending college. Like that's just a very specific
Yeah.
group. So I think it's super, especially when you look at studying things like neurodiversity and like all these different like psychological, it's interesting, right? And some
Mhm.
studies will do the Jay Shetty one, I know for not for the shock thing, but for some parts of it, they did like a community replication. And it's like, then like that, like good. Like, cause then you're showing, like, look, we started with this group, then we expanded the group. It's kind of like how medical, like you start smaller
Yeah.
and then you get bigger, and
Mhm.
that's fine. But it's just like, at least know what stage you're at. Like, if you're at the stage where it was only like 20 college students, let's not
Mhm.
pretend it's necessarily, it could apply to everyone. We don't know.
Yeah, that's true. And when companies are trying to sell a message or send a message, sometimes they may ask a smaller group of participants. So maybe it was 10 people and nine of those 10 people agreed, right? And so they're saying
Yeah.
90% of people totally
Yeah.
agree with this.
Yeah.
Um, but ethically, there's a gap, right?
Oh,
It's
totally.
misrepresenting.
To me, I feel like if that's what you do, you should say, we talked to 10 people and nine people said, but no one, that wouldn't be compelling for people, right? It would be like, oh,
Mhm.
you only talked to 10 people. So it is instantly, it's like, well, let's just use a percentage. It's like, I
Yeah.
agree though. I think it's hard because you have the competing needs of marketing and like getting people to like want your thing with actually reporting something responsibly. I will say I respect companies a lot more when they're like very like tempered in what they share, where it's like, you know, this is how many people we talked to, this is what we saw, or like when they're committed to like ongoing research. I use a probiotic called Seed, and I like them because they do a ton of like research on like scientific strains, and they're like doing a study with the FDA. And someone asked me the other day, they're like, but like, do you think it really works? Because and I'm like, I think it's like worked well for me, but I like that like they're
Mhm.
committed to this process, and like that's winning points with me. I'm like, I don't actually care if like 9 out of 10 people you talk to would recommend it, because I can see that you're actually like, I want to be like transparent about the studies we're doing and how we're making these choices. And I think that I hope more people like push companies to put more emphasis on this, because to me, I think transparency over a cool stat any
Mhm.
day, even if your numbers are like horrible, I would respect you so much more for being and we're being transparent and we're going to like learn from this and do something different, because the
Mhm.
odds we get things, especially like in the medical field, right on the first try, like it's so complicated. Like, of course, it's not
Yeah,
always going to look great.
that's true. One thing I wanted to touch base with you on before we end this show, though, is uh, for me, black and white thinking is something that I just really hate. It's like you have to either be yes or no, or this is good or bad. And we see that in every layer of media. It's like, well, it could be good and bad at the same time.
Yeah,
Or someone can be a good person but do a bad thing once in a while,
yeah,
right? And it's not always
totally.
black and white. And when you do surveys, sometimes it feels very black and white, yes or no. And then on the scales that they give, in particular, we all are familiar with the 1 to 5 scale, right? Like, strongly agree, slightly agree, those
Yeah,
kinds of scales. So, how accurate is that, and how can we use that information, I guess?
yeah. I think, oh my gosh, I will say the first thing I think about if it's like agree, disagree is because the 5 is like that middle neutral point, which to me is actually like the most problematic point. So I think people need to think about, can you be neutral on this subject? Because for a lot of people, like neutral means I don't have to really, like, I don't have to commit or answer this question. And so that's not really that helpful. I've seen a lot of organizations move towards like the agree disagree, and then they'll put like an I don't know option, because I don't know is actually like helpful information. I worry sometimes that neutral is code for like I don't know what you're asking me, right? So if you
Mhm.
ask me to agree or disagree with something, I'm like, no idea what this is. I would rather check I don't know. Um, but I think one of the things that helps to make those responses more reliable is you ask multiple questions that are all getting at the same thing to see if people are like tending to think the same way about it. Because
Mhm.
people don't, not everyone loves survey data, which I understand because it's like, it's subjective. Like you're asking me to like report to you honestly like how I feel about things, and like that can be hard, and like people might not feel comfortable, or people may not have like really reflected on it a lot. So I think there are things that you have to do to like set people up for success, which starts with like why do you need my information on this? And so really understanding why is it important that I like take a minute and like reflect and answer like honestly, and like what will that do for me, and like are people going to know I responded this way and come after me?
Mhm.
So, like, setting up, I think, a comfortable environment, but then also writing the questions so that it's just like really clear what I'm agreeing or disagreeing with, right? Like, I don't want to be confused about like the language you're using. I don't, right? Like, I just want it to be like, I understand this statement, and like, do I think it's true or false? And I like that they have like the 5 point has some variation where it's like not at all or like a little
Mhm.
bit. I think that's good. But again, a lot of times we'll ask the same thing in like a few different ways to see like if you are agreeing to all of those or like only to some of them, so we can kind of gauge like where your truth is, right? I think people get annoyed. It's like, why are you asking me the same question like seven different ways? It's like, because I want to know how you really feel about it, so I'm going to ask you in seven slightly different ways to see if you feel the
Mhm.
same way or not. um,
Yeah, and in psychology, there are questions like that built into surveys because it kind of can create the truthfulness, right? We can
yeah.
see how truthful you are on a certain
Yeah.
survey. And so people always ask, well, how do they know, like in court cases? Well, how do you know
Yeah.
that they weren't trying to be crazy or trying to
Yeah.
present as an insane person? Well, these tests that they created have these built in questions that are repetitive throughout the test
Yeah.
so that if the person is trying to create false outcome, it would catch it, so then that test would be
Right.
thrown out, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like you try to make it hard to like cheat the test.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how
Totally.
they do it on some of these standardized tests. That's what they want. So you will see like repeated questions or slightly changed questions, but it's there to catch you in a lie.
And I think that it's helpful for people to know that too, because when you see surveys where it's like, we're just asking one question about this, it's like, I don't know if one question is enough to like be sure that like everyone understood it and feel right. Like I always am
Mhm.
like, could we get like at least three questions about that, just to your point, like to make sure we're like capturing like as close to truth as we can. But also, I don't know if I talked about this last time, but the extent to which you can make questions like behavioral is like helpful, because it's easier to be like, how often did you do something, than to think about like agree disagree. I'm like more likely to remember if I did something like 5 times last week than to be like,
Mhm.
I run a lot, agree or disagree. It's like, don't ask me that. Be like, how many times did you go for a run in the past month, right? Like there's just, if a question doesn't have to be about my like my beliefs about what I do, and you can just ask me what I do, I think that can also be helpful in getting accurate responses.
Yeah, it's scary that some policies are being created by these surveys that are not scientifically vetted, or the research may not be there, but yet policy will be created from the
Yeah.
outcomes of these, and especially when you look at environmental or science impact,
Yeah.
um, it can be, yeah, quite scary.
Actually, I told my therapist the other week that I do therapy at a university center here, and they send you tons of surveys. And I told her that I was like, I lie on that survey literally every week. And she was like, what do you mean? I was like, it asks me about like all these like range of emotions and how often I'm feeling them. but the scale goes from like never. The next option is like several times a week. There's nothing between never and several times a week. And I was like, so I always put never because never is not true. But if I'm like, I just, the several to like depression, and I'm like, I sound like a mess. I'm like, it's not several, it's like in between
Mhm.
never and several. But it's just interesting, right? Where it's like, so you're collecting data that's like forcing me, I have to lie. I'm either going to lie and like really round down or like lie and round up. And it's just,
Mhm.
those would be such quick fixes, right? But people have been using them since the 70s and the 80s. And like, this is just how we ask about these things. But it really is, it's just interesting to think about. It's like, are you giving space for people to like say their truth? And like, should you be using that information to make decisions and say, like, look, no one's depressed anymore because everyone's putting never. So like, we don't need more funding for this. And it's like, well, there's no like, it's just, it's messy.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And I think if when data is collected, you want it to be as clean as possible, like a definite yes or no or definite number assigned
Yeah.
to that data, because open-ended data, then you have millions of different
Yeah.
options that could come in, right? And then how do you filter what is valuable out of those open options?
Well, it's also open-ended options are so easy to analyze incorrectly because like we're human. So if you're reading through them and someone says something like really, really good or really bad, whichever way, that's going to stand out to you. And so even if it was just like one or two or three people who said that, that might suddenly be a key finding. And it's not. It's just like that stood out to you, or reading things that align with what you already thought, right? And it's like,
Mm,
oh yeah, like I'm only seeing thing. And it's just, we're humans. That's like how our brains work. But that
mhm.
makes that type of like qualitative written responses hard to analyze. It's like you should actually be going through like a really rigorous process then. And a lot of people don't have time for that, or once you're at scale, don't have time for it because it's not just like 10, it's one thing with 10 responses and it's another with like 100 or 1,000 or 10,000. And I think they have definitely done some work with like machine learning around like analyzing qualitative data. And like that's interesting, right? Like if you really could automate some of that, would be helpful.
Yeah, what is your opinion on AI? Do you see that as having a place in the future for analyzing
Yeah.
this or even creating these kinds of
Yeah.
questions?
It's interesting. It'd be really, so I use Qualtrics platform and they have an AI. They basically like grades your questions for you and it's like pretty limited. There's like a couple, like 8 dimensions or something. And it'll tell you like, hey, you're asking like way too many open-ended responses, or like you're asking too many questions that look like this, or like this could be hard for someone who like has a learning disability. And I think that's really cool. And the extent to which, like, again, I think they're like learnable, like rules of thumb that I'm like, if you could teach a computer to like screen for that, that would be amazing. I think in
Mhm.
terms of analysis, I'm just like not, I'm like just not fully trusting, you know, like Qualtrics does like a qualitative data. They can give you like a word cloud, they'll screen like positive, negative things for you. And I was like, I would do it, but I was like, I would always want to do it also by myself just to see if I like agree. But I think that there's definite potential there. And if you're looking at someone who like is put in a position where they have to do that type of research and have no experience, I'm like, well, then that like might be better than like them going rogue or like using Google to like have some sort of system built in. So I think there's definitely, I think it's interesting. I don't know, do you ever use Grammarly, which is
Yeah.
like, right? So like Grammarly to me, like mine's got like pretty good. And I actually love it because I feel like I learn about a lot of things with sentence structure that I clearly did not learn in school. And I'm like, I think that that really showed me, I'm like, you can teach like computers things. Like it can finish my sentence a good proportion of the time. And that to
Mhm.
me is really cool just to think about the future there. I don't
Yeah.
see humans ever not needing to check things, but maybe.
Yeah, I definitely need Grammarly. I haven't invested in the paid level yet, but just the unpaid is very helpful.
I got the paid level, I want to say maybe last year. It even, because it'll tell you, it's like, this email sounds like strong and assertive. And I'm like, oh. that's like nice. And then sometimes it's like you sound like too passive, and I'm like, that's so true. It's just so interesting. It's like doing a tone analysis, and yes, and I really like that because I'm like, oh, is this email about to sound like too mean? I'm like, Grammarly will tell me it's fine.
Yeah, I like that. I'll have to check it out. So I think we'll go ahead and end. We're at 45 minutes. Are there any resources or things that you would want the audience to look at in the future if they're analyzing data or if they're seeing some statistic and they need to know how accurate that is?
Yeah, I would say like honestly, if you ever read a statistic and want to know if it's accurate, the first thing I do is copy and paste into Google and just see. Like I just think it's an easy like DIY, like see where else
Mhm.
it comes up because if people are doubting it, it will come up very quickly that's like this like we actually dug into this. There's like bloggers who've been I feel like on the case for misinformation since like the 90s. So I would definitely recommend um, Googling it. I have a YouTube channel where I like talk through different like issues in research, like sample sizes and making design choices and how to ask questions. And then also critique certain articles and surveys that come out. And obviously like love to have people check that out. But I really think Google's a pretty great tool just to dig in. And you can also always like email the people who wrote the article or who did the study and
Mhm.
I feel like a lot of times people are pretty responsive to that.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I think you should link your website to the
Yes.
conversation. If people watch this back, then
Yeah.
they'll have easy access to
Yeah.
your
Thank
YouTubes. I find them really helpful. I've looked at quite a few, so
thank you.
hopefully the audience will find them helpful too. And thank you
Great.
so much for
Yeah.
talking about this with me. I know we have had a lot of recent articles that were questionable that we could bring up. So it's good to talk about
Yeah.
research ethics and what needs to be followed up on. Right?
Yeah. No, I'm like so excited that you created this space. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, we will end.